Hi, I am Jeffrey Warnick, and here again with Bruce Fein for another Fine Points. Bruce, it's been about 3 weeks since the last time we've had a conversation, and uh, a lot has happened in a 3 week period of time. There are a couple of things that I would like us to talk about today, and I'm sure you have a lot of things that you would like to talk about. But the first, and I know that we've had a number of uh, podcasts where we've discussed this, but it seems to be an issue where there still seems to be a lot of misinformation and malinformation, um, and uh, and with respect to the concept of due process. So we have Stephen Miller still talking about eradicating due process, and there seems to be in Magaland a reasonable level of support for this, and there's still the conflation of saying because you believe in due process that you really want to let these people free, as opposed to we have a process when somebody's a criminal. There's a process on how we have this, and nobody's talking about freeing all these people. It's just people having the ability to defend themselves. We have a presumption of guilt, innocence in the country, not a presumption of guilt. And to eliminate due process means it would change our whole legal system to be a system based upon presumption of guilt, not a system based upon presumption of innocence. So I don't know why that is not it's not clear. And you can sit and have all these things, um, uh, being discussed, and it's unbelievable to me. And so maybe Bruce, you'd like to address this point.
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey, because I think you hit on a very fundamental feature of our dispensation, indeed of civilization. Due process is perhaps the most important idea in the history of the world. The recognition you could be wrong, especially government, and that it's better morally to let a few wrongdoers escape than that the innocent suffer. Those are fundamental precepts of civilization itself. That does not mean that the system is perfect. It's administered by human beings, so there can and will be errors. But we would rather err on the side of protecting the innocent than making sure that we catch everyone, but in the process, we punish even more innocent people. And we know the probability of error is exceedingly high without due process. And we look at the example of World War II, 120,000 errors, 120,000 Japanese American citizens and permanent residents herded into concentration camps, said to be saboteurs, engaged in espionage, 100% wrong. Not a single Japanese American was convicted of any criminal violation in World War II. 120,000 errors. Later acknowledged by the United States Congress and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and reparations were paid. So that's the magnitude of the errors that we're risking if we don't permit those who are charged with being in the country illegally due process. Remember, no one is omniscient, especially, and we've seen it over and over again. When the government is asked to provide evidence and they say, sorry, just believe us. If the executive says it, it's true. We know they have no evidence. I served in the government. If the government has incriminating evidence, even if it's classified, it gets leaked out in like 30 seconds because it's beneficial to them. The fact that they have no evidence, well, I think they got a traffic ticket against Abrego Garcia in Tennessee years ago. That's it. They had no evidence that he's a criminal, that he belongs to a gang or otherwise. Is it an indication? It doesn't exist. And truly, people think right now Trump's targeting people that they may not like. Don't worry. He has already deported U.S. citizens, something acknowledged in Washington Post reports. And if anything the president says goes, He could identify anyone on this program. You, me, Ryan, the watchers, the listeners. You're a terrorist. You don't get to prove your innocence. Hey, you're deported. And then once you're deported and the government concedes you're there illegally, they say, sorry, and we can't do anything to help you, which is again is a lie, because Mr. Trump himself, during the week that you're absent, Jeffrey, said, yeah, I can pick up a phone call the president of El Salvador, and Abrego Garcia would be back in 30 seconds, but I don't want to do it, which of course is contrary to what his lawyers are telling the courts, which is going to expose them to contempt, in my judgment. This is something that we simply have to teach over and over and over again. Due process is not perfect because it's a human institution, but it's far superior to all the alternatives that have tried in millions of years. So let's stick with it. We stick with due process even if it enables O.J. Simpson to escape a guilty verdict out in Los Angeles. It's an injustice, but how many lives that we've saved because we continue to insist on due process. And Jeffrey, this should be inculcated in the first grade in the schools. It should be taught in Congress before they can take the oath of office. It should be taught to the President of the United States. Due process, this is why it's important for civilization itself. And yet we have these talks about all this other drivel, about the Gulf of Mexico, and now it's the Gulf of Arabia, whatever. It shows how far we are removed from the essence of what has made the country great for so long.
Can I chip one thing on the back of that, Bruce, that I think is the real key for the average person out there who may not be immersed in all of this? The simple mentioning Stephen Miller, the simple response that keeps being put out because it's easy to digest despite being ridiculous and wrong is that there's, 4 words, whatever. Are you illegal? Then you're deported, kind of a thing. And that's the only process they get. And so fine, let's just even say you agree with that, even though that's incorrect. What Bruce just said is important to digest. If you believe that, that means, even if just by accident, that the authorities can come up and say, Bruce Fein, you're an illegal alien, you're being deported, and send you to El Salvador in a matter of days, and then after that be like, oh, well, sorry, we didn't know, and he's still there. Like, if you can't acknowledge that that's possible, and you're okay with that problem, especially in a government system where we know that that kind of problem can be used and abused, that, then you're just lying to yourself. And I think that's the core point of this. And I don't think it's all by accident. But even if it was, that's why due process is there, even for illegal aliens. So I think that's super important to start with. So
yeah, Brian, I think you make a great point. I mean, what you could see, what we could see possible, they could take a hit list of people that they view as their enemies list. Mm-hmm. They can catch them on the street, say, show me your proof of citizenship. And if they doesn't, and most people will bring a driver's license, but a driver's license is not proof of citizenship, So you can sit back and say, you haven't provided me sufficient evidence that you're a citizen, so I'm assuming you're illegal, and I'm bringing you directly to the airport and delivering you to El Salvador, okay? Mm-hmm. And once you're there, I'm going to say it's beyond my powers to be able to do anything about it. Oops, I made a mistake. Too bad, and that. People don't really understand that they could do that, okay?
And he's floated 5 times sending Americans already. 5 times President Trump has insinuated. And on top of what Bruce said in regard to the children that were actual American citizens, there have been multiple times where American citizens have been this close to being deported. And the only reason they weren't is because the Supreme Court had kind of put a stop on what they were doing. And then in that stop moment, they were able to prove that they were citizens, and that's due process for you. But had that not have happened, they'd already be in El Salvador. That's insane.
Or Libya,
arresting citizens.
Or Libya. Yeah. It was a leak. It was a leak that got people, because initially they denied they were doing anything with Libya, and now the evidence was that they were doing it. How anyone could believe they make these statements? I don't know how any court can assume without evidence that they could trust and rely upon the statements made by anyone representing the Trump administration in a court.
Yeah. Well, yes, Jeffrey, I think that's really, really hurting the court. I mean, the administration, and why at this stage, my belief is that Trump will lose over and over and over again, because he walks into court after all these misrepresentations and the executive said it, and you have to accept it at face value. No in-camera evidence, that means secret in-chambers review of the evidence. You just have to accept what he says as being true. After there's a repeated statements that are demonstrably false, especially in the alien area, where he's done 2 things that are utterly insane. One said Venezuela is attacking the United States. We're engaged in war with Venezuela, which of course is absurd. And then the second thing that he said, contrary to what his lawyers are, oh, I'm helpless to get El Salvador to repatriate, our Americans who should be back in the United States. Really? And there you're going to have the courts going to believe anything else that this gentleman says? And it's not, these are even Trump appointees, like him saying that he really didn't exclude AP News from the press pool because they refused to state that the Gulf of Mexico wasn't the Gulf of America. He lost that one too. This is out of his own appointees. So this idea that it's the deep state and it's all Biden appointees doing things, no, these are Trump loyalists who are finding this totally over the top.
And it's also worth noting that there's Trump judges too. Go ahead.
This is the Trump deep state weaponizing government against the American people.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, on top of that, there's many Trump-appointed judges that have ruled. I mean, even the Supreme Court is 6 conservatives. It's this game, like you're saying, of making it all some kind of secret Democrat holdover, or it's in almost every one of those cases, never actually identifying those names or people. It's an excuse. I think it's very clearly to give them a bone to run with because if they look at the real picture, it shows you, like you're saying, Jeff, it's actually weaponized against them, and they don't realize it.
Yeah, I mean, this is so crazy to see what Alice in Wonderland we're living in. So we have the Attorney General appointing a working group on preventing weaponizing this administration of justice. That's exactly what they're doing. They're purporting to attack the people in the past who weaponized justice, and in the process, they're doing what they're purporting to condemn. I mean, this is really insane. They should be investigating themselves, the Department of Justice, because you are weaponizing the Department of Justice, as clear as can be. When they openly say that if you criticize anything, and suggest that you are not an echo chamber of the administration, then you're a danger to foreign policy. You get visas revoked. Your free speech is denied. You don't have access to government office buildings anymore. If you've ever done anything the Trump administration does not like, and they've, of course, lost over and over again in their efforts to blacklist law firms who represented causes that the Trump administration didn't like. Anyway, it's coming to a day of reckoning. We can only hope that Mr. Trump finally sees that he's going to lose in the Supreme Court and his ratings are down, and he will ultimately surrender to the court decisions. We don't know that yet because he's already floated trial balloons in the newspapers and through J.D. Vance and others suggesting, hey, I may not comply with the decision of the United States Supreme Court. After all, he made the stunning statement, the first president in history, 235 years, he's not certain that he has to comply with his oath of office to preserve and protect the Constitution of the United States. That is, he says, maybe I can commit perjury, maybe not. I'm not certain. I'll leave that to somebody else. I mean, really? A kindergartner could understand the oath of office in Article 2 of the Constitution. He feels unembarrassed by making this statement on all networks that is shown to all the world.
And apparently none of his lawyers seem to think it's part of their responsibility to make sure he does understand that he needs to uphold the Constitution. So nobody's gone back to him and reminded him that he has this obligation, unless they don't believe it either. So maybe the lawyers should come out, maybe Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Kristi Noem should come out and say, this is the Trump administration and this doesn't apply to us. So we're exempt and immune from upholding the Constitution. So because so many people voted for us, and given the fact that so many people voted for us, that act voided our obligation to uphold the Constitution. Because that's their argument. Their argument is that we're not a constitutional republic. He got the most amount of votes, and because he got the most amount of votes, that means that the Constitution doesn't apply to him. He doesn't know it because the people voted for. He's been clear about what he's going to do, and the people voted for it, and he's going to do what people voted for. I don't think the Republicans felt that way when Biden won, okay, or Barack Obama won. I don't think their attitude was Barack Obama was saying, I can ignore the Constitution. I got the most votes. I got a bigger electoral vote. I got a bigger popular vote. So I had a bigger mandate. So the Constitution doesn't apply to me. I don't think many Republicans were talking about if Obama would have gone out and picked up people on the streets and sent them to some country that Republicans would have been silent about, citizens being sent abroad. So this is, and these arguments, it's sad to see for me, not that it's unexpected, but sad to me that politicians who know better prey upon people's cognitive biases.
Right.
So they understand these are phony arguments. Okay, when they say, you're for the terrorists, they know that nobody's for the terrorists. This is for principle of an inalienable right. Okay, the same as freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Okay, this is all part of the Bill of Rights. It's all part of, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. This is all part of what was a requirement to get the Constitution approved. Okay, in order to get the Constitution approved, there needed to be a Bill of Rights because it wanted to be clear that government power needed to be limited. Okay, so that was a requirement. So due process is equal in importance as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and all the other constitutional protections, that are embedded in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So if you say one of them you can throw out, you can use the same argument for throwing any of them out.
Right.
Yeah. There's no articulable firewall.
Understand that. Go ahead, Bruce and Ryan.
Yeah. We did understand it a while, back when I was in the government. This is during the Nixon days, and it ultimately led to his impeachment. But we understood. We took an oath to support the Constitution. When I was in the Department of Justice, who was our client? It was the United States Constitution. When Nixon was challenged with the White House tapes, he wanted it to be named. He wanted to be named the United States. We said, no, United States is the plaintiff. You are the defendant, Richard Nixon, in your individual capacity. Mm-hmm. That was the understanding at the time. Everyone's oath is to the Constitution, not to the personal occupant of the White House. And at that time, Jeffrey, Mr. Nixon won 49 out of 50 states, more than 60% of the popular votes, 520 electoral votes, and he still could not run roughshod over the Constitution. These are famous words of Justice Robert Jackson in a case during World War II. He says the rights in the Bill of Rights are not subject to the outcome of any election. Right. They stand irrespective. Even if 100% of Americans wanted to destroy due process, they can't do it unless they amended the Constitution with a proper process. It does not matter. Indeed, the Constitution was built on the understanding that from time to time, popular majorities would become hysterical. It was trying to prevent rashness from running roughshod over the rights of minorities. Now, this idea that elections can destroy the Constitution would be insane. If that argument were made at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they would never ratify the Constitution. Said, no way, that's not going to happen. Now, one other thing I want to point out, and this is a little bit side, I want to go back to Jeffrey Miller's, Stephen Miller and habeas corpus. Jeffrey and Ryan, even in the United Kingdom under monarchy, the monarch could not suspend habeas corpus. Only the parliament could suspend habeas corpus, the right to due process, right? And if you look at our Constitution, the suspension clause is in Article 1, the legislative power clause. Right. There's no way you can read Article 2 as endowing the president with any authority to suspend habeas corpus. So now Trump's making an argument that I was given more power than the British king who created the American Revolution. I mean, it's so loony. You kind of laugh and say, really? Can serious people make these statements and not evoke laughter?
See, but this is what it's really about for me, and this is I see it, and I think this is really important. Is that so? To that, as you said, for those who should look this up for yourself out there, if you haven't actually read the Constitution, it's the powers are endowed. I think the word they used for Congress in the first, then they go and describe the different parts of Congress, and it makes it very clear that that's Congress that can decide, which makes sense about the writ of habeas corpus. And I think Lincoln, even you could argue, was unconstitutional when he did it, right? Because they didn't actually use Congress. And the point is that has to be
Jeffrey. I need to interject to defend Lincoln. He said, I acted without Congress, and he got it ratified and retroactively in the Habeas Corpus Act of 1863. So he acted in emergency. He said, what I did was illegal. You can impeach me, but Congress ratified it. He went through the process. So these people saying, well, this precedents happened before, it didn't.
No,
Trump has never
thank
gone to
you.
Congress to get
Thank you.
anything ratified.
Right. That's actually very important to include. Thank you for that, because that matters in regard to, the outcome. But the point's the same, as you made clear, that he still did what he did was illegal. And that's what they're trying to argue, is that Trump unilaterally can do this today. Miller said that in his conversation, leaving out the constitutional point. But so where I think this comes important is that I think the Constitution has been attacked and undermined by the government, left and right, for a very long time for this exact purpose, because it does hinder their power. And so I think what's important to think about is, well, let me read this first, actually. This is from, to go back to your point earlier, Bruce, this is Theodore Roosevelt. He said, to announce that there must be no criticism of the president, or that we are to stand by the president, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but is morally treasonable to the American people. Overlapping that with the point you made last time about Mabry versus Madison, it's very clear to see that this is their ability to basically destroy what the Constitution is, and I think what's important is, what I was going to say, to bring up the Afrikaners point. And like this overlap to where they're basically bringing in a whole nother separate conversation I want you guys' thoughts on in regard to the same kind of manipulative point and all of that. But before we get to that, I want your thoughts on the other part of it. Go ahead.
Well, you're exactly right that it's to be silent and not criticize is treasonous. It's not treasonous, or there's nothing complimentary about just being an echo chamber of the executive branch. But I want to go to the Afrikaner issue, because it shows that the Trump totally disregard of language and history and law. Remember, during apartheid, when the Afrikaners were oppressing blacks, stealing their diamonds and gold, there was the passes, there was the Bantustans, right? Blacks could not get refugee status in the United States from fleeing South Africa. Of course, all of them would qualify, right? As being the victims of racial discrimination. Now, suddenly, the Afrikaners are said by Mr. Trump to be suffering racial discrimination by those who they had been oppressing for literally centuries and stealing trillions of dollars from. And where's the evidence of the oppression? Are they living in Bantustans? Do they have pass laws that limit to where they can travel? Is there diamonds and gold being stolen? And now Trump says, they're qualified for refugee status. But Afghans who helped us during our war in Afghanistan by being translators, they're saying, no, you don't qualify for refugee status, even though the Taliban has them on the hit list. I mean, this takes wild language, into the never land.
But I would think it's important to point out, though, and I'm sure you'd acknowledge that there is racial violence that is happening, and I wouldn't say nobody here should accept it, but it's understandable that you would see that after some kind of back and forth situation, the response back. But to your point, it's important is that this is imagine making this about, they're using the word genocide, to be clear, and ignoring the metrics in other conversations, and then arguing that this is like racial-based land discrimination. Like, I just think it's wildly tone deaf to make that the point with what's going on in the world, and then it, like you said, it's contradictory to every other point they've made about assimilation, about resources, it's just, and on top of that, American taxpayers are spending more money for this than usual, and they're kind of rapidly doing the process, less background checks. It just seems like you have to acknowledge it's because of their skin color.
Why isn't Trump offering citizenship, fast track citizenship for the Gazans?
Yeah,
I would assume that if you ask many of these Afrikaners if they had a choice of staying in South Africa or being in Gaza, I bet you they would. I bet you. I don't know how many would say, the United States. If Trump offered all these people in South Africa to say your situation is really bad, we'll pay for a trip to Gaza and you could be in Gaza, how many of them would take him up on his offer? Okay,
right.
So given the fact that Gazans probably have it significantly worse than these Afrikaners. And again, maybe some of these Afrikaners have it bad. I don't know all the details, but the question is, I don't know how many of them are starving. Okay.
Well,
I don't
you can see the video they put out. They stepped out of the gap in the mall. It basically seems to me, not to diminish some suffering they may have, but they look like any other suburban town when they, you know what I mean? And so it's just insulting for them. Sorry, Jeff, I just had to say that. Go ahead.
But so I wonder how many that said, gee, you're really bad off in South Africa. We'll send you to Gaza. Okay. How many of them you think take money to go to Gaza? Okay. I bet you none of them. So the Gazans have it worse than the South Africans. Why aren't we making the same offer to the people in the Gaza that we are of, and we are these Afrikaners. And Bruce is right also. We had people that helped us in the war in Afghanistan for a long period of time. We surrendered. Trump surrendered, not Biden. Trump surrendered. Trump surrendered. Maybe the way Biden executed it was far from perfect, okay, flawed, okay. But the reality is there was something signed by Trump. Trump's trying something with the Taliban. He did not include the Afghani government in the process, so he basically ignored the Afghani government and the people that supported us, and he basically allowed for the remaining term of his administration, as long as the Taliban were targeting the Afghanis, he didn't care. I mean, people don't talk about how many Afghanis got killed, because once he signed that deal, the Afghanis became free game. The only thing he cared about was them not going against U.S. troops. Yeah. So we had all these people, and then the people that helped us got on this hit list, but supposedly they don't deserve asylum. So people say Mexico is a narco state. We see all the violence there. They're not entitled to asylum either. So the only persecuted group who seem to be eligible for not only asylum, but fast-track citizenship, are these Afrikaners. So there apparently is no other persecuted group in the world. And this administration is trying to change the narrative. And the narrative is that no group has a right to legitimately claim victim status unless they're white. Okay.
Seems that way.
So this is the new narrative out there, is that the only ones who are victims in this world today are whites. Okay. And this is what woke culture has done. What culture has persecuted whites, and the whites are the real victim class. And the whites are the ones that need all these special protections, from all these minority groups that are imposing this woke ideology on us all. So,
but we should remember, Jeffrey and Ryan, this is somebody who pardoned somebody who was openly and notorious involved in January 6th as being a white supremacist, defended by Ed Martin, the once nominated head of the U.S. Attorney's Office in District of Columbia. This is somebody who decided in Charlottesville, well, maybe there's some pretty good white supremacists too. They're not all so bad. And this is somebody who, as to build on your point, says, at the one hand, we're denouncing Maduro, the president of Venezuela. We're saying it's a horrible, horrible country. We impose sanctions on him. We have indictment for involvement in narco trafficking. And then we say, if you're fleeing Venezuela, you have nothing to fear back there. Well, wait a minute. You can't be on one hand saying it's such a horrible country, we're sanctioning them all, and then saying the people who are fleeing, well, they really shouldn't worry about going back there and living under this complete tyranny. Horrible, 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 and being charged even with international bodies with genocide. But again, it underscores this is a white supremacist government. Whether you call it, you put euphemisms on it, that's clearly what's going on here. They're even trying to undo the celebrations and the monuments of the freedom riders, the civil rights movement, removing Harriet Tubman from being celebrated in some of the national parks and things of that sort. I mean, probably shut down remove slavery from the National Museum of African American history and culture. And really, there was no slavery in the United States. But anyway, that's just calling a spade a spade. It's a white supremacist government.
I think it's important to comment on at least the way I view this. And I think all these things we're talking about are like, even starting with the woke discussion from what Jeffrey's pointing out, I see this personally as a means to an end, which doesn't mean that there's not people within the government that very clearly believe some of those radical things we're seeing. But I think from the top down, taking the woke point first, I don't think it's necessarily that they're trying to jam that in. I think that's a means to an end to achieve a certain endpoint, like with Afghanistan, from opium fields to minerals in the mountains that they defrayed for the cost of assistance. They've put it, like that. That is what I think it really comes down to, or even the white supremacist point. Like, I think it's important for them to get the people reacting to the culture war as opposed to the real dynamics. And that, again, that doesn't mean, like, I'm with you. I think there's very obvious overlaps to this administration currently that, and personally, I feel it's because of Israel's influence throughout this administration that there's a racial supremacy here that's very obvious. But I don't think from the highest level of the conversation that that's the real game. I think it's about getting us arguing about this while they achieve the larger ends of these countries. And I think personally it comes down to the kind of technocratic direction, different conversation. But I think that's what I'm seeing through it, that they want us arguing about things that do matter, right? But like the statues, different points, while we're missing the forest for the trees, which is the complete subjugation of our lives, the control of our lives, foreign policy, in whether we're talking about Afrikaners or what they're doing in Gaza. It's like, that's how I see it. But not to diminish the reality of what we're seeing, I just don't think that's the real agenda of the real power structure. Personally.
I don't think, Ryan, they're inconsistent. I think everything that you said is true. But remember, this is out of Trump's own mouth.
Right.
The only people I trust to count my money, not blacks, Jews. Those are the Yarmulkes. That's out of his own mouth, right? So I don't think we have to do much stargazing to understand what's inside Mr. Trump's brain.
Or his statements about he's come out and spoke about Muslims in a broad scale sense, as if they're all anti something. Any statement of a broad stroke of any kind of person, color, religion, it's disgusting, right? That is lowbrow, lowest common denominator. So I agree with you. But the question is that what he believes, or is that him trying to cause a rift? Either way, it doesn't matter for me. I think worth calling out is the point.
No, I think to the extent that there's a discussion on culture, I think there's a difference between what each of our cultures are as individuals and how we express them in our own households. And then there's a public culture, which is a political culture. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the political culture, there's only one culture for people living in this jurisdiction, and that's the Constitution. Okay. There's only one political culture. Everyone's private values, for what they do inside their house is their business. Okay. What we do in politics, there is only one culture that's defined by our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our inalienable rights, and the limitations we place on government from interfering with our life. So that should be the culture that we should remind people of, that's the common American culture. Okay.
Can I say,
when people come and live here, that's the political culture that they accept. They accept to be governed by the rule of law in this jurisdiction, whether they're here as a guest, whether they're here as a citizen, whether they're here with a visa, or even when you're here illegal, you're still living, under the terms and conditions of the document that represents the national contract, and the national consensus is the Constitution. And there's no discussion of that culture. And why is there no discussion of that culture? Because the president has no regard for that culture. They have no regard for the Constitution. They're at war with American culture. Okay, in my opinion.
I agree.
Okay? Because that's the only culture that's been consented upon. Okay.
Can I add one point that I mixed myself up with? I read my notes wrong and went to the Afrikaner point. What I wanted to do before, even though that's still relevant to the conversation, was bring it. I'm glad you brought back the Constitution, because what I think is important, what I was saying before about how it's aimed, governments want to destroy this, in my opinion, is that we've seen, going back to the last election process, where the Newsweek actually put an article out that discussed how they had to sort of destroy democracy to save democracy. Remember that? Where they literally argued they're like a shadow government stopped Trump. And that was like, they were praising like the thing that was exactly what they said the other side was doing, right? And the same way we're seeing today. This is what I wanted to bring it back to, all of government picture. You've got them trying to basically arguing that we have to, and they've even said it like this, basically, or discussing the suspension of habeas corpus, basically destroy the Constitution in order to save the Constitution. And so you get the same kind of argument from either side, arguing that all we need to do is just trust the power structure, because if you let them run roughshod over the Constitution or destroy every value we have, they'll put it back in place once the good side wins. And I think this is a really dangerous sentiment that I think a lot of people have fallen into, thinking
to build on your point, Ryan, I remember when Biden was elected, when Trump was his first term, there was criticism legitimate about all these executive orders and bypassing Congress. When Biden was elected, all the liberals said, we just will do it by executive order if we can't get by legislation. I mean, I remember even with Obama, with regard to immigration, first he said, I can't do these things that the liberals want without getting a statute changing the immigration laws. Then he said, well, I can't get the statute passed. I just do an executive order or a memorandum. That's how we had, the child deferment issue. That's not how the system works. Get a better argument. If you can't get it through Congress, sorry, the system doesn't work any other way. And I do think that it's very, very important that we understand. I mean, in some sense, our immigrants understand the importance of process more than we do, because they confront all the horrors in their home countries. That's why they're here. And then you find some of those who now have had their visas or permanent resident status revoked because they had the audacity to suggest that what's happening in Gaza is not a tea party. It looks more like genocide, as the International Court of Justice has said. They are effusive at praising their opportunity to get in court and have their voice heard. They understand the importance of process more than our own people do. Where do we need a citizenship test? Not like immigrants coming in. They need a citizenship test to graduate from high school. You can't leave high school unless you know these fundamentals. Process is everything. Process distinguishes the rule of law from the rule of the jungle. Simple as that. And that has to be inculcated over and over again. I think what we're seeing, and Jeffrey's seeing, our culture doesn't do that anymore. And at the highest levels, we have people who have no clue what that means. It's just, we do what we can get away with. And if we can get away with it, who cares what the rule of law means? Posterity could inherit a tyranny, but hey, that's their problem, not ours.
Our government's been instilling that mindset for a long time from both sides of the paradigm, right? Yeah. Might makes right. Trump today really leans into the might makes right sentiment, but the left does the same thing in foreign policy, just doesn't say it the same, you know?
Yeah. It's solely disregard for process.
Right.
I think that also I'd like to add, with respect to the justification that Stephen Miller gave for suspending the writ of habeas corpus, the basis he's using to justify that suspension of the writ of habeas corpus would not just apply to illegal agreements. Right. That would apply to every American. I think most Americans don't know that. Yeah. But the argument he made for its suspension would not be unique in application to illegals. It would be unique. It would be an application against everyone in this jurisdiction, independent of the status that they're living in this jurisdiction. So for the 330 million plus American people occupying this geographic jurisdiction, none of them would they all would have the right of habeas corpus suspended. Every single one of them.
Right. I want to, let me elaborate on that, Jeffrey, to show this. What that means is that all of us and everyone listening, watching, could be detained, arrested, without any access to any court to argue the lack of justification for their arrest. They can walk into anybody's home and say, we're going to take you off to the dungeon. And you know what? You're going to sit there and rot, and you can't ask a court to require us to explain why there's a reason for your detention. 330 million illegal arrests forever. There's no limit on how long they could hold you. This goes back to the power of the king. In pre-revolutionary France, they had something called letters de cachet, and the King Louis would issue them, could, on his unilateral decision, go to any French person anywhere in France, put them in the Bastille, and that was the end of it. Really? That's how radical Stephen Miller is.
Mm-hmm. It's terrifying because he's convincing people that this is in their interest. Like I said, this is what's necessary to save the country. You know, and to your point, Jeffrey, I completely agree with you. It's amazing how short-sighted people can be when they think they're getting what they want. But I argue that even just the idea that you can suspend, like, let's just take it away. Like, let's just say they do it without Congress. Because it's an interesting conversation, by the way, Bruce, I'd like to have about whether that even seems to make sense. Even though it was an original part of the Constitution, it's interesting that there was an article to suspend habeas corpus. But that if they were to do so with unilaterally, let's say, the idea then becomes the same thing we're seeing in anything else. That if they say we're going to do it within the law, well, that has no meaning anymore. The law is what they make it, you know? So it's like, once they pass that threshold, it's just downhill from there, you know? And this is where I come back to the point about whether Congress is going to step up and do something about the Supreme Court rulings and whether he does anything. And like we talked about that last show, like what that ultimately means. Because I think that's the breaking point. If we recognize that he can take it as far as he wants and there's no repercussions, the rest kind of becomes meaningless at that point.
Well, the interesting things for me, and that with respect to your point, Ryan, is what happens if he doesn't like the rulings of the Supreme Court?
Right.
And he decides to ignore them. he can make a judgment on whether, one, does he have popular support for ignoring them, and will Congress impeach him for ignoring him? And the calculus might be that he will have enough public support to ignore, because they seem to be still looking to get rid of people, and they don't seem to be in compliance with the court orders that have been made to them that are pretty clear. It seems to me that they're in violation of them, and then making very lame excuses on why they're not in violation of them. And some of them are just lame excuses, and some are probably just outright lies.
Mhm.
So the question is, I don't think he's worried about Congress impeaching him, and he might not be worried about public opinion. So I think there's a good chance he'll just ignore the courts, and he'll continue this verbal warfare, which he's already begun against Roberts. I mean, there's already, Roberts has already didn't he just comment yesterday or today about, the endangerment of a rule of law that we have in the country now. So there seems to be, to some extent, this war of words, where Roberts thinks he needs to speak out because he sees a denigration of rule of law and thinks he can't stay silent on it. But the question is who's winning the media war, Roberts or Trump? And maybe Trump is winning. And so maybe people will accept Trump acting in violation of the Constitution, and there'll be no check against him because the people won't check him, Congress won't check him, and the courts can't, because they have no way of enforcing their rulings except regarding the goodwill of the other two branches of government, who one has ill will and the other is just completely dysfunctional.
Yeah. I think history provides at least some source of optimism. And let me give you two instances, Ryan and Jeffrey. One, Roosevelt basically ran against the Supreme Court for invalidating the New Deal in 1936. He said it was living in a horse and buggy era, with motor vehicles in its interpretation of the Constitution. And he won 46 out of 48 states. It was like the Nixon landslide. Overwhelming House and Senate Democrats, only a handful of Republicans. And he then thought that he could get his court packing plan pushed through, which he introduced in 1937. But it was a disaster. As much as he had a popular mandate, even his own party pushed back and said, we're not going down that road. And the bill never even got to a vote in the Senate. And we had, say, something similar when President Richard Nixon was flirting with defying court orders requiring him to surrender White House tapes during the Watergate scandal. The public opinion turned against him. The courts did. Even Congress did, however, at that time. Even Barry Goldwater, Hugh Scott, the Republican leadership, and Nixon backed down. Now, the difference is I think the culture has deteriorated enormously in the 50 years that have elapsed since Watergate. So we don't know yet. But you are right. Congress is doing nothing unless public clamors, you need to do that or you're going to be voted out of office. Ultimately, public opinion is the last safeguard, because you point out the courts, they don't have the power of the purse. They don't have armies. So unless they're supported by the public, there's no way that they can force a president to comply.
I see two things that make me more pessimistic. I would say realistic, but let's say pessimistic, and say you're an optimist, not realist. But and I'll tell you what evidence I look at for making my judgment. One is the amount of people who, so-called Republicans, who support Trump is much higher level of support than in the past. I mean, so the type of support he gets within the Republican Party, is the party is more united around Trump than they are about previous Republican presidents. So he has an influence over the party, through his popularity, through the perception of people that he's, cleaning up all the defects this country has had for a long period of time, and that he has a unique skill that only he can do. He could be the savior. So that's the one piece of evidence I have to say I don't think it's like the past. I agree with your other point that culture has deteriorated significantly. And the other point, and maybe you might be correct me on this, but I have the impression that the economic power he has over the Republican Party is more economic power than previous presidents has, because he controls almost all the money. He's the fundraiser for the party. So he's the one, so he's the one that controls the distribution of money to everyone. So he's got two weapons: his personal popularity with the majority of the Republican Party, and he's got all the money. And I don't know whether Nixon or had that much popular support amongst his own party and control the money, or FDR did, and that maybe also, and between that and the significant deterioration in our culture, that maybe I'm more concerned that Trump is somebody who plays brinksmanship. He always goes to the border, crosses over, and waits to see what his limits are until somebody stops him. I don't see anybody stopping him. So I don't see the people getting outraged, by these actions, because there should be outrage about when he makes a statement. Really, for him to make a statement like that, how bad our culture is there should be people saying impeach, okay? That no one should accept. No one should be president who says the answer, I'm not sure that I have an obligation, to, even though my oath of office is specifically to uphold the Constitution, maybe that oath I don't really have to take very seriously, because my hand wasn't on the Bible, or my fingers were crossed, or I'm Trump. So so my word is is superior to God's word. So so where are you on this point, Ryan?
On that note, I think I'm in the middle of it, and I think what's interesting is that I think there's 2 points to make. Is that one, the question about I agree with you on the influence, right? Money and the party. But so the question is, the party itself, is that the majority of even just that half of the conversation? Or, is it, we're talking about the team sport kind of influential leadership versus the people of that party? Because here's what I see it as, and this is just a left-right kind of government versus people point, but just applying to the right, which is that I think, you court these people by professing to be a constitutionalist, by professing to care about free speech. So what's interesting is I think anybody who has even the smallest amount of discernment is like, well, that's not really what's happening right now. Like, you can maybe be convinced to think that him doing that will lead to that point. But I believe I have more faith in the American people. I think that most people in this country, are uncomfortable but trapped in the paradigm, that recognize that this is not what they wanted because they were sold something that's not happening, right? And so I think it really comes down to that one point about whether that party is representing all the people, and then secondarily, the social media, AI, technocratic place we're in, where you can present a false reality in a way we've never been able to do before. And it's, how can you prove this? I don't know. But I think most Americans are ready to see a positive change. And that's why we are seeing sort of like this, bait and switch of like, here's the positive thing, but I don't think that's what's happening. I guess my point is that I think most people are aware of these problems, but they are professing to be doing what the people want. And the pieces aren't falling into place, because the only place in the world we can see what we call the majority is corporate media, social media. And I think we're being lied to on both those fronts, So I think that if we really were able to stand back and see some kind of full picture, I think most Americans are aware of these problems, want free speech, want the Constitution to be upheld, and just either don't know are literally at the point where they're thinking, well, Kamala would have been worse. So they don't know what to do, right? So they just go, I'm going to be quiet. And then all they do is highlight the screaming people on the side that are invested in Trump or are part of the team sport politics. And I just don't think that's the majority. That's my opinion, though.
I think that the one pushback is the United States Supreme Court. Despite what I consider the worst opinion ever in Trump versus United States, you can tell from Chief Justice Roberts' statement, and he's not the only one who's voiced concerns about the executive branch trampling on the rule of law. Other justices, at least 3 or 4, have voiced the same concern. I do think that at this stage, if in the first time in the history of the United States, the president said, the Supreme Court made a decision, I'm not going to comply, I do think the push would come back. I think that Trump then would back down, and it would I think he would continue to violate the law in less important areas. He's, as Jeffrey's pointed out, he's already shown he's willing to be in contempt of the lower court decisions concerning immigration. I think we may be able to hold the center this time, like we did with Nixon, but unless the culture changes, there's going to be a successor to Trump. We need to underscore no successor is going to yield back voluntarily one whit of power that they inherit. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened ever. No executive surrenders power that they inherit. And it's going to happen again. And I don't know whether, if the culture doesn't change, it's going to hold that time.
Well, he has ignored the Supreme Court with respect to Abrego.
Yeah.
He's clearly come up with the term, his definition of a term, facilitate, is clearly not what they meant. He's ignored it, and then with this judge trying to get the information to determine whether he was gamed by the administration when he gave the order to not send those people to El Salvador, and they said by the time that when they said it was already too late, but they won't provide the information because they say that's privileged, secret information, for national security purposes. They can't share with a judge who was on the FISA courts, who has a lot of experience handling that type of information. They won't give it to him, in closed quarters. They're just depriving him of access to it. And then the question is, what will the courts do? Will he go after these people and find them in contempt and put them in? I mean, this is what could happen. I mean, what could happen is maybe they'll be found in contempt. The question is, if they're found in contempt, what can Trump do to protect them if they're found in contempt?
If it's criminal contempt, Jeffrey, he could pardon them,
Right.
Yes,
which is possible. But my point, Jeffrey.
If it's criminal contempt, he could pardon them. If it's civil contempt and there's a fine, he could pay the fine. So it might become irrelevant, and then the question is, if it's a fine, who can enforce that the administration will even pay the fine? So, so this is the problem. The problem is they might not, that people might have gamed the court. They're lying now, but they're never going to give access to the information that will demonstrate they're a lie, because the courts will never be able to have the type of discovery to prove that there was a lie. And then when he says, well, you're not giving me the security, you're in contempt, that they'll just ignore the contempt. Citation, they find a criminal contempt, he'll just pardon them. So I mean, this is the game. I can't believe, as an American, that I ever would have lived through an experience like this.
Right.
But I think this is what we're living through now, and they're going to be people on Fox and Newsmax and all these people defending these people and calling the judge radical, lunatics, leftists, communists, traitors and things like that. And there'll be more time in Congress spent trying to impeach the judges rather than impeach the president.
So let me ask you this, both of you. So if, from my perspective, if I'm correct and that they don't have the majority opinion on their side when it really matters, like that the majority of people are resigned to stay on their side or maybe going to vote for him again, but don't agree with the constitutional points, right? And so what we're discussing is that Congress seems to be inept. They're not going to do anything. And if they do, it doesn't seem that he seems he can circumvent it anyway. So if we're in this position right now, I mean, I don't see a way out of that. Not to be an alarmist here, but if we're in a situation where I guess the only way to stay all this would be as if the public spoke up in enough numbers and it was acknowledged in enough way that people recognize that it wouldn't behoove them. The juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze. Outside of that, why wouldn't they force this all the way? I just don't see why they wouldn't.
No, but I think if we show what happened in some, not the exact same situations, but similar, with regard to how public opinion and sentiment can push Congress to do things that seem counterintuitive. In 2013, President Barack Obama asked Congress for a declaration of war against Syria for alleged chemical weapon use. Even Ted Cruz's and Tom Cotton said no way. And the reason was, and I was up there, because every single communication they got from their constituents was no way. We are not getting in another war. It influenced the decision. I remember the first vote of the House of Representatives, the so-called TARP bill that that George W. Bush proposed, to bail out all the rich people so that everybody who actually borrowed the money could go into foreclosure of their homes. When the overwhelming input from texts and emails was no, the House voted against it, even though it was said that it's going to bring a depression worse than 1929. public opinion is that if the members think that their jobs are on the line, if they don't go along, they will go along. If they have to choose between their job and Trump, they're going to choose their own. These are egotists. These are narcissists like Trump.
I agree with everything you're saying, Bruce, but I don't think the people are going to speak up.
Well, here's the big question, though.
You think
What
they will?
if they're
I don't
trying
think
to?
they will.
What if they're trying to, and that's no longer like, okay, there's two ways to look at it. What if people are in whatever way they can trying to make these things heard, and it's just no longer being represented, or secondarily, it's no longer being shown to the people that might want to see it? Those are very real concerns with the world we live in today, with with social media, technocratic control, censorship, so that was kind of my point, is that whether or not the majority might be able to, does that really change anything if it's not being shown to the people that need to see that? Or
no, but all I can tell you this, because I'm up there, Ryan, every day in Congress. All of the offices got email addresses. It is not difficult to register your voice with Congress, and they know about it. And you can handwrite letters to and get it delivered. They know exactly how to do it. You don't know to reinvent the wheel. You can do it the same way they had to do it in telegrams at Watergate, because we were in the digital age. And there's no screening. You have direct access by sending in through the emails, and it can be done far easier than it was to send a telegram.
Is that represented somewhere as as like a metric that we can follow?
Yeah, I mean, sure. That they count the what's coming in on their emails. That's what they look at very closely.
No, like for us though, as the public. So because my question would be, if they don't want, like, so if I send an email with myself, I don't know whether I'm the only one in the world that sent that. And I think if the narrative is people are being convinced that they're wrong and you're alone, look at what the crowd is doing. And so I wonder whether or not those people, if it even behooves them to acknowledge they're getting those anymore and just go in with what the money's coming from. You see, I know I'm very pessimistic when it comes to what government is today, but I worry of that. And I think that might be where we are in regard to, so I guess what I'm saying is the one thing that we could do to stop this is to get enough people to speak up and make their voices heard. But I worry whether that has been circumvented. What is in their interest to make those voices heard?
Well, one of the differences between my growing up through Watergate and today is with Citizens United. The money influence, it was always there earlier. But now, it's at a level of 10 where it used to be at a level of 2 in politics. That's why Elon Musk has so much power with Congress. He's an ultimate dolt about what he's doing, but he has the money, and he says, well, I'll primary you, and it makes at least many members frightened. And that diminishes the relative influence of a single voice just from a voter who can cast one vote. And that is tilts in favor of, I'd say, Jeffrey's realism or pessimism, that the American people have the resilience to push this pushback against Trump, and maybe they don't care. If they don't, we know what's going to happen. If you don't care, the natural tendency of all politics is towards tyranny and one man, one woman government, and that's where we'll be in a very short period of time.
And historically, that is where it's always ended up. Sadly enough, we've got to fight for this. Is the point?
Yeah. Another topic I'd like to discuss, and then everyone else can talk about the topic they would like to discuss. I have so many I'd like to discuss, but I just want to choose one so everyone else can choose their own topic. Bruce, you used to serve on the OLC, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So here you have a scenario, and I put this in the group, how absurd I think this gift is. So this is really a personal gift, because it's, one apparently this is, from what I've seen articles, that this is supposedly the most spectacular, private aircraft in the world. So they're going to deliver it to him. The government will fix it up to have all the security things in it. He can use it while he's president. After he's president, it's going to be transferred to the presidential library as a donation. I guess that'll be a tax-free donation. So he will basically continue to have exclusive. So this right now, giving it to him, it's not being given to the American people, because the American government is not going to long-term. This is something that really has his exclusive access, or whoever gets on it by his discretion. Okay. Then when it gets to the presidential library, again, that'll be used for his exclusive use, or anyone he decides would have use to it. And then from what I read further is that after a period of time, it'll be transferred over to Trump Force One. So, and apparently this is all being done in a way that ultimately this is only for his benefit. He won't get, and he will get basically a tax-free gift of $400 million.
Yeah.
So this is clearly absurd. I don't see how anyone could think it's not absurd. Really, I think you have to be a real moron to think this is not absurd. Really, you have to be a moron. Okay, anyone who doesn't think it's absurd, I wish they couldn't vote. Okay, because you really have to be a moron to think this is not absurd. Okay, this is clearly a personal gift to him. He can use it while he's president, and then he can use it post-presidency. So this is for him. Okay, so Pam Bondi says this is okay. If you were part of the Office of Legal Counsel, what would you be telling Pam Bondi?
No, this is clearly a violation of the Foreign Emoluments Clause. Again, most of these provisions, Jeffrey.
Is it a close call?
No, this isn't even a close. $400 million. I mean, the whole thing is a joke, and we know the Qataris are doing this, we think this is benevolence. This is philanthropy. No, they're buying access. They're buying influence.
I have to make another statement, this Bruce, and then I'll let you continue.
Yeah.
Trump said, "Look, they offered me $400 million gift. Who would say no?" Okay, and you got to be a loser or an idiot to say no. Well, Hunter Biden could have said, "I got offered this money. I would be an idiot to not accept all this money that I'm being offered." What's the difference?
Yeah, he said we would be stupid. But moreover, I mean, in these prohibitions, it said they're not academic prohibitions. One of the reasons for the Foreign Emoluments Clause, because the framers understood that at one point, King Charles II was taking bribes from King Louis the 15th to engage in warfare against the Dutch without any declaration from Parliament. They showed that, hey, if we need a barrier like that, we don't want to have our foreign policy co-opted by bribes, which is clearly what's happening here. The Qataris aren't doing this except because they believe the foreign policy that Trump will display towards them will be more beneficial for them than if they didn't give the $400 million aircraft. I mean, did we just born yesterday? This is a crass, open violation of the Constitution. And remember the famous words of the United States Supreme Court, it prohibits both sophisticated and simple-minded violations of the Constitution, okay? So you can make this more sophisticated. You can run through shells, games, and say, well, the title of the aircraft was in the foundation of the museum or something else. I mean, we'd have to be lunatic, or as Jeffrey says, a moron, not to know what the underlying dynamic is. And the dynamic is exactly what the Foreign Emoluments Clause is intended to prohibit, having our foreign policy warped by personal gifts received by the president from a foreign entity. Simple as that.
Right. I mean, it's obvious. This is if this was Obama or Biden in exactly the same circumstance, everybody would be screaming, the people that support it, and this is where I'm going back to the point is that people that were fed the idea that this administration would fight for the Constitution or believe in the rule of law, that and wanted that. They look at these things and go, that doesn't feel right, but they just kind of get quiet and they lean in, and then he does the thing where he goes, you'd have to be a fool not to take money given to you. It's tapping into the lowest common denominator. So you get people out there that go, yeah, I want money. It's like, and they just cheer it on because they don't understand. I had a question though, Bruce, are you referring to, because I was just going through this on the show the other day in regard to the habeas corpus point on, it is, what is it? Article 1, section 6. Is that the part you're talking about? Or is it something else? Because
Section 10 is the Foreign Emoluments Clause. Section 6 is speech or debate immunity.
Well, because it argues in there that it says no senator representative shall. I guess that applies only to Congress in that point. Then I guess that's the point.
That's right. Yeah.
The same argument then emolument. So it's interesting. I was looking that up as you were saying that. The idea simply being that this is, transparently represents some kind of a benefit, a price, a fee, whatever the terms that are used. And just because they argue it can somehow, well, see, this is what's interesting. If they would have tried to maintain this as a presidential tool, that would have been their way around this. But instead, he has to make it his own. This is why I can't help but wonder if this is like designed to destroy what we're talking about.
This is done for his exclusive benefit.
Yes, I agree with that. But the question is this designed to destroy the Constitution, or to allow some, increasingly rapid kind of, like with Stephen Miller and habeas corpus, like every day there's actions that are being taken that rapidly set precedents in a destructive way to the Constitution that they argue are within the Constitution. It's like, I can't help but see that as a deliberate action meant to destroy the Constitution. Maybe I'm wrong, but.
Well, let me quote, this is the actual language, the text of of Article 1, Section 9, it says, no person holding any office of profit or trust under the United States without the consent of the Congress may accept any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. It's pretty straightforward. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the idea that
Somebody disagrees with you.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's so frustrating is that this is cut and dry. You know what I mean? Like, it is just as clear as day. It is a textbook, literal example of what we're talking about. And you get people that and what the worst thing is, you get people that are in powerful positions. You get the Rubios and Millers that come out and with a very smug indifference argue that this is absolutely so clear. And then you get all the people that never choose to look into this, that just repeat what they're told. And there's millions of them out there that mob all these platforms. That's what I'm talking about, is that presents a very dangerous, misinforming view of what you should think or what people think. And I think that guides a lot of kind of aimless people right now that don't know where to go, but they fall in line.
Ryan, think about some of the cases. One is even the press coverage of this, it says it's troublesome. Okay.
Yeah, right.
It's like troublesome. No, this is illegal.
Right.
Okay. There shouldn't be any doubt. There shouldn't be any questioning of how bad this transaction is. But it's like the same thing as like saying that this tough student, who wrote an editorial, that somehow that editorial in the college newspaper had an adverse effect on the execution of U.S. foreign policy. Really, when people make these, how does a judge listen to this and and if this is your best argument, and clearly these are their best arguments, okay?
Yeah.
So
and let's not forget though that she was just ordered to be
come up with. So this is his best. They all got their brain trust together. Rubio, Kash Patel, okay, Pam Bondi, they all got together this brain trust, okay, on Signal probably, okay, having this conversation, okay, and the best thing they can come up with, Trump says, you got to find a way of saying of getting this stuff. I need you to come up with some loophole. So they're charged with this job of coming up with the best argument they can come up with, because this is the outcome they have to produce. Okay,
I don't know what scares me more.
This is their best argument. If this is their best argument, it's so pathetic. Okay, how can there be any doubt among anyone how pathetic these arguments? Who really, again, you have to be a moron to think that anyone who writes an op-ed piece in a college newspaper, probably seen by 100 people, write an op-ed piece who just says, Palestinians have some rights and we want peace in the Middle East and this war's got to stop. And somehow that statement in a college newspaper, okay, is endangering the execution of our foreign policy.
But how do we actually think that?
That basically says free speech impacts foreign policy, and therefore anyone who says anything against the policy of the administration, okay, is adversely impacting its execution of foreign policy. And maybe we should call them traitors, okay? Maybe we should put them in and charge them with treason and they're traitors. I mean, really, how absurd is it? How dumb do you have to be to not understand that?
But
what level of IQ do you have to not be able to understand that?
Right. But this is the thing, though. It's like, look, I'm not of the mind that these people are necessarily very smart, or some of them have their their abilities in certain ways, But at the end of the day, I don't think they're that stupid. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think, like, I feel like them together, even as much as I could diminish a lot of them, could come up with a better argument. That's why I just can't. I'm like, what are we missing here? What is the outcome? What do they want people to be outraged about? Like, maybe they are just that stupid, Jeffrey. It really wouldn't be that shocking to me, but I don't know. It's pretty. I mean, I think.
No, listen, Ryan,
I don't think they're that stupid.
Ryan, they are that stupid. Ryan, they are that stupid. One judge called their arguments no better than a toddler of a 3-year-old.
I agree.
We have Doug Collins. He's the new chief of the Veterans Administration, and so early on in his tenure, he talked about cutting 83,000 out of the workforce, right? And then he's asked at a Senate oversight hearing, what were the greatest challenges the first 100 days? And he says, well, it's confronting all these adverse, vile rumors. Like I wanted to cut 83,000 from the workforce. And then a Democratic senator said, but it was your talking point, Mr. Collins, and that's the rumor. Anyway, then he says we need to move on
Crazy.
to a new question. I mean,
Ryan, I don't think
get dumber than this, right?
I think
I
some are
agree.
dumb, but I think what you really have is some people who are smart who are just doing things that just don't have justification. And this is the best argument they come up with because they don't really have a good because they have no really facts supporting them. So they have to come up because they were told you got to justify it.
Well,
You
here's
got a
what
bunch of people, reasonably smart people, and this is the best argument they could make. And so, given the fact that this is the best argument they make, that's an indication that either they're very dumb or there's really no justification for what they're doing. And I think most of it is there's no justification for their doing it, and they just can't come up with a better argument because they have a weak case. So because their case is so weak, they have no good argument.
Well, and
So
to that point, remember Donald Trump himself. This actually, so I'm still on the fence because it's hard for me to wrap my mind around them sitting around going, yes, that makes sense. It's just crazy. But Trump with the thing with the knuckles. Like, look, I think we all know that Donald Trump has a lot of hubris. I think that's how people manipulate him, is by playing into his belief that he is so good at what he does and whatever else. Is that he clearly either was willing to embarrass himself by pretending he thought that was a real tattoo, right? I don't know if you saw the interview. That was a rough one.
Yes.
He really pushed back in, or he really didn't know, which then shows me that there's somebody within him corralling him, giving him false information, allowing him to act. And so it's like, think about that. So that kind of adds to your point that they are that stupid, and there's somebody above them that's essentially using that for their own ends,
But Ryan, the president himself said the other day, he didn't even remember signing the executive order under the Alien Enemies Act. He said, did I sign that?
Yeah, he tried to blame Rubio, right? He tried to kick it off on Rubio.
Was I the one who sent Abrego Garcia to El Salvador? I don't even remember that. I mean,
Gosh.
this is but he does remember the 250 pencils and the 33 dolls that every child has, but he doesn't quite remember the definition of the word stroller. Oh, it's the kind of thing that you push babies around in. I said, oh, you got a kindergarten vocabulary? I mean, you got to make it up. This is stupidity on steroids.
Well, let's go back to his willingness to use phony bullshit arguments. There's enough history of it. I'll give an example of one that I always like to give. In the case, the civil suit made against him about his basically, and again, this was a case of illicit enrichment where he made false filings to the banks, and he got basically disgorgement of the profits he made that he would not have had if he had made accurate filings to the banks. So when he presented, he claimed that there was a disclaimer on the document where he basically said, I'm putting this information on a page, but you should not rely upon any of the information. You're sophisticated and you're supposed to do your own due diligence. And even though I signed this promising it to be truth, I've given a disclaimer saying I have no obligation to tell you the truth. And therefore and he said this under oath. Okay. So the disclaimer was not put in by him. The disclaimer was put in by the accountants, and the disclaimer did not say what he said it said. The disclaimer just basically said, okay, we've presented this final information from you, and we're letting you know what were the sources of information when we came up with the valuations. The disclaimer was to protect the accountants. They put a disclaimer in basically saying, okay, this is the information we're presenting, and some of this information we're relying upon an appraisal done, by Trump himself or some designated person or whomever did the appraisal. And so they were just they never said we're telling you it's false. Okay, they never said not to rely upon it. They just said this was the sources of our information. So because they didn't want the banks to go back after them for making false representations. So their disclaimer was to protect the banker, but it was not a disclaimer that said the information was false. The disclaimer was them, the bank, the person, the accountants that presented the information. They were just basically saying, "I'm relying upon this information, so you should know about what I'm relying upon for the information." They never said it's false. Okay, they never said it's all bullshit, and you got to rely upon and do your own due diligence. Trump making that statement is a lie, bullshit, a lie. He knew he was lying. He knew he's full of shit. Okay. And yet nobody's charged him for perjury for that lie because he lied. But that's the extent he'll go through to justify nonsense. Okay.
Read his books.
So,
He'll tell you that.
So I'm trying to point out this is his mentality. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So he approaches everything with this mentality, and he's surrounded. And what's the difference between the first term and the second term? The first term, he's used to Trump organization where he tells people to do, and they got to do everything he tells them to do without questioning or thinking. Okay. The first term, he had the frustration that he had people pushing back at him. You know, he had adults in the room who said, "This isn't constitutional. You can't do this. You can't do that." Now he's got an administration where he says, "This is what I want done. You got to get it done." Okay. So they don't question or doubt or debate. They got to figure out how to execute what he wants them to do. You know, and if he doesn't execute, they'll get fired. So
that's a good way to frame that, Jeffrey. For what you were just saying, that's a really good way to think about it. Like, you just answered my question. Like, right there that would make sense if you've got him, you know, lighting a fire under Pam Bondi, and all of a sudden she's like, I have no other way to make this make sense other than this ridiculous argument. That's the best we can do. So yeah, that makes sense. If you're being forced into a position and you don't know how else to argue it, that lines up.
But remember the handful of attorneys who did try to suggest, I don't know the answer to this, they were fired by saying you're not being zealous enough. Right. And defending lunacy, right? So they fired anybody, you know, who had a brain.
The head of FEMA was asked the question, do you think FEMA should be shut down? They said no, and the next day they lost their job. Yeah. So were they supposed to lie under oath? They were they were asked a question about their point of view. Yeah. So they had a point of view different than the administration's point of view. And because they do that, you're fired. I mean, so the message is clear, okay? Everybody's gonna say what he wants them to say, and if not, they're out of there. Okay, it's as simple as that. So, and we have another thing. You know, I also was appalled by, you know, the videos, the partial videos that Fox and some people got hold of it. What happened in Newark, New Jersey? You know, that looks like that's a mess. And apparently, from what the mayor is saying, is initially there was no problem with ICE and the people there. It wasn't until DHS got involved that it became, you know, this chaos. And when I'm seeing the video, I'm seeing a whole bunch of pushing and shoving going on. So unless you have a video from a broader perspective, you don't know who did the first push. And then other people are just, it's like bowling balls where somebody, you know, the ball hits somebody and that pin is hitting other pins. Okay. So, and some of those other pins, you know, are reacting to being hit by some other pin. It's a reaction, not an intentional action. And, you know, so from what I saw of the, you know, the congresswoman, you know, the big congresswoman, you know, that she had somebody pushing her from behind. And then one of the things that I think people don't talk about is when she started yelling, she was raising her voice, and then somebody with a mask came to her and was getting in her face. And then somebody with a coat, and I don't know if it was what DHS or what organization her coat was on, who basically separated the two. And then that's when I saw the congressperson getting angrier and angrier, and then really raising her voice. So we don't know what that ICE person, whoever it was, who got into her face and started saying whatever he said. You know, no. I don't know if anybody's asked him what he said and what she said first and what he said, and I don't think he's going to be investigated. You know, for the way he might have mistreated, you know, a congressperson.
No, Pam Bondi never investigates anybody who does anything that thinks Mr. Trump would like. I'd like to at least do a little bit of a sidetrack here to make this observation. What we've seen is really the danger of the migration of power to the executive branch, and see how it stifles dissent. It stifles the ability of self-correction because no dissenting views are offered. The reason why the framers believe that Congress should be first among equals, because despite the fact that you may not have geniuses, it has a deliberative process that's forced. You got to convince other people. It's open. It's, you know, they don't have classified information. I can walk into any congressman's office right now within 10 minutes. And that has at least a beneficial self-correcting process. You expose the stupidities. You expose that there's no light at the end of the tunnel in the Fulbright hearings. You have dissent is permitted, in part because you have more than one party there. It's not perfect, but at least you have a check against stupidity. In the executive branch, it doesn't exist. Once you make one dumb decision, all dissent is snuffed out. That's what happened for sure in Iraq in 2003. Anyone who dissented from the fact that, oh, they're going to throw flowers at us when we march into Baghdad got fired. And so all the argument that you would hear if there was real debate in Congress, which there wasn't, and to detect the flaws in the reasoning, go out the window. That's why you never want to entrust these important powers to the executive branch. They should be executing what Congress does. Not because Congress is flawless, but the process is going to weed out the stupidities that doesn't happen in the executive branch. You know, the domino theory that prevailed in Vietnam for 20 some years. It was insane. No, but Vietnam went only communist. No, now we're an ally. You know, the whole world didn't go communist. But that kind of ventilation, which was all an executive branch brainchild, never gets discussed in Congress, never discredited, and it lives forever.
Yeah. Excellent points. I mean, and I think that's, any consolidation of power is kind of like the antithesis to what we, at least I hope, the foundation of this country was really about. It's like, I just have doubts about, whether their intentions were true, everybody in that original room, but nonetheless, it's clear that that was the idea. I mean, even the idea of a federal government itself seems to have been kind of counter to some of the original ideals. And here we are. I mean, exactly what we were fighting against in every possible way. Now, even further, now even more alarming to a specifically executive of that dynamic. I mean, it's just, this is my point again about why most conservatives out there were at least sold a bill of goods, for something other than what's currently happening. So I'm always calling on those people out there to just speak up, say something, you know what I mean? Like, stop being silent because you're afraid to be ostracized. Stand with your principles, Yeah. And I will go ahead. Do you have another comment, Bruce?
I was going to say, yeah, without a doubt, the president of the United States exerts far more unchecked power over us as citizens than King George III ever did over the colonists, by orders of magnitude. And that provoked a revolution against King George III. And we sit here docile to the president who's exerting vastly more powers, secret, vastly more military weapons, police, money, and all that. Where has the spine of the American people gone? We could not find 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence to risk their lives, fortune, and sacred honor today. Nah, it's not worth it. Yeah, we'll just go along with the king. Get along, go along. Liberty isn't all that important. Our posterity can inherit tyranny, but that's okay. I mean, that's really the cultural norms that we have right now.
When I discuss people, Ryan and Bruce, on this point on executive power, and Bruce, you and I have had this conversation before. In Federalist 69, that's the Federalist where Hamilton tries to remember. People forget that after the American Revolution, we had the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so the people who were in the room, Ryan, that you're mentioning now, on whether how much they could be trusted, or whatever. What we can trust is the fact is that they knew that whatever document they produced would require very broad consent. So they know that type of document that had a lot of executive power would have never gotten the type of consent to replace the Articles of Confederation. So the people were suspicious of executive power, and so they knew whatever their intentions were. They knew the reality that this had to be approved by a supermajority, to get authorized, and so they were constrained by knowing that they had to get not only a simple majority, but a supermajority. And so there's only so far, however many people might have wanted a more vigorous executive, that was never going to get ratified. Okay, and they knew what could get ratified and what could not get ratified, and the ratification was not an easy process. That's why they produced the Federalist Papers, because they had to convince people, and they had to produced a lot of Federalist Papers because they had to do a lot of convincing of people, who were suspicious of granting any more power to a centralized federal government. So the states were not eager to surrender power to a federal government. And that's basically what they had to sell people, is the states, is you're all going to be better off, by allowing this federation, confederation, Madison used different words for it. And even in the example, like when in the paper where, and again, Federalist 69, where Hamilton's talking about the power of the president, when he does call the president an officer of the United States. So that's clearly in Federal 69 that Alexander Hamilton says that the president is, I would assume, a public meaning document that would be the Federalist Paper to describe, the role of the president as being an officer of the United States, that should end the debate on what the intent of that role is, but apparently it doesn't. So, but the other thing in describing really how not strong the federal power has, given the fact that that we were never supposed to have a standing army, and we were not supposed to rely upon a standing army. When they talk about the commander in chief, Hamilton also makes the point that every governor is also a commander in chief, because what was the military then? Most of the military, when it was state militias, that reported to the governor. So the governor was the commander in chief of each state militia. So really, this power of having no state militias and having this one federal army controlled only by the president is not what was contemplated in the Constitution. So when people say commander-in-chief, the Constitution calls them commander-in-chief. No, you have to read Federal 69, and basically that's the point that Hamilton said is no, this commander-in-chief is a limited power because every governor is also a commander-in-chief because they're basically relying upon state militias for the national defense.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah, but he's even more specific. He compares the commander-in-chief power as substantially inferior to the King of England. And he says, unlike the King of England, who can make treaties on his own, who can go to war on his own, who can raise money to fight wars on his own, he says, all of these powers under the Constitution are entrusted to Congress, right? And that's what he said. Now it's the opposite of what de facto happens in the United States. And to underscore what you're saying, Jeffrey, despite the fact that everyone knew that George Washington was going to be the first president, and they trusted him, because he had turned away a crown. He had to be dragged out of Mount Vernon even to come to the convention to serve. Despite knowing it was going to be George Washington, not Caesar or Caligula, they still had suspicion of executive power because James Madison noted, we're going to get George Washington once every 1,000 years. And we cannot build a constitution on a phenomenon that comes around once every 1,000 years. It's not going to work. A last point, just to reinforce your statement about officer of the United States. It's not just in the Federalist Paper, Jeffries. Article 2, Section 4. The president, vice president, and other officers of the United States shall be subject to impeachment for bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Got that? President, vice president, and other officers of the United States. Can it be clear the president is an officer?
That's pretty clear also. But, and so if we think about now the application of U.S. foreign policy now and U.S. power, okay, right now, U.S. is not at war, so we would not really rely upon a big standing army because we needed an army in times of war, not part of peace. During times of peace, we have basically just state militias. So right now, if we wanted to go and do action against the Houthis in Yemen, okay, there'd be no army to do it. He'd have to go to the states and get the state governors that he can't force. He can't coerce the state governors to contribute their state militia to go after the Houthis. Okay, this was the idea of the founding fathers. They didn't create an empire. Okay, a point that Bruce makes all the time. They didn't design an empire. Okay, they designed a constitutional republic with a small and limited government that basically had almost no money, and even a little bit of money they had, people like Jefferson thought was too much. Okay, and they were trying to reduce government spending, be below 3% of GDP. So,
I think what reinforces your point, Jeffrey,
if the U.S. wanted to go to war, it's not like there was one guy, one person who had this huge arsenal of $1 trillion budget, okay, and that was at his or her personal disposal, okay. That was not the design of James Madison, okay.
No. And to reinforce your point in the anti-empire attitude, the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, to facilitate a well-regulated militia, was calculated in the understanding that we would only go to war in self-defense, and the militia would be called out without a standing army in self-defense when we were attacked and invaded. And it wasn't the idea that we would be going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That's ridiculous, utterly insane. And that was true even though shortly after the Constitution, all of Latin and Central America were in upheaval and revolting against the Portuguese and Spanish empires. We didn't lift a finger. We didn't send one soldier, nothing. They just they let them fight out their own independence movements. Could you imagine that today? I mean, Wilson, they're going into Mexico. We said they had an unstable government. We have chasing Pancho Villa with General Pershing for a year. I mean, utterly contrary to every conceivable understanding of what this country was about when it was founded.
It comes down to trying to create a threat justification for the asterisk moment, right? And this is what we keep seeing everywhere. Like during COVID-19, it was like, that was one of the common statements, right? It doesn't say, shall not be infringed except during a pandemic. It's like the joke, right? And so it's the same thing happening today. The threat of and weirdly enough, going back to even like the threat of the incoming Mexican scourge and a whole conversation. It's the same kind of conversation now, right? The argument of immigrants coming to take your jobs. I mean, this old stories. Today, it's just another argument to say, well, that's the threat. So here's why we have to suspend this or pause that or ignore. It's never stopped. So it just comes back. That's my point, is for the longest time, we've had elements of the government trying to find ways to remove these checks on their power. And I think today we're just really seeing that kind of final thrust, if you will, but that's why it's so important that we hold true to these things, because as you're pointing out, both of you, these are principles. These are not things that are changed with time, like it comes down to the upholding, like the point of, if we have to give everyone due process, there's just too many well, then too bad. Like then that's the reality of the circumstance. Just because you created a big enough problem for it to seem like that's implausible does not change the principle of it. This is where we have to lean into today.
Yeah, it's the breakdown of separation of powers. And the biggest culprit, to be candid, is not the executive. You can expect everybody try to usurp power, but Congress is the culprit. They gave it away.
Right.
They have all the architecture is still there. They could use the power of the purse to dictate everything to the president if they invoked it. They could shut down every single war, all these efforts of violations of due process. They can use the power of the purse to control it all, and they do nothing. They don't even have oversight hearings anymore. Congress actually has the power of inherent contempt. They can hold and imprison executive officials for not responding to a subpoena. It hasn't been used for 100 years. I mean, this is the trump card that they have to ensure transparency, and they do nothing, completely zero. I mean, it's totally irresponsible. They have abdicated all of their responsibilities. It's truly disgusting. That's the breakdown of separation of powers. The courts were envisioned as at least a partial, check, speed bump in the road of the executive branch, but Congress was supposed to be the major player, and they gave it all away. And no one's willing to stand up and say the emperor's got no clothes, whether it's a Republican or Democrat in the White House.
Doesn't that speak to some kind of an outside influence? I mean, whether that's just lobbying of big pharma or a foreign nation, Israel is, I think, an obvious point today of like AIPAC and lobbying, but any number, I mean, for the longest time, Republicans have worried about China influence, which is a valid concern. It's like, to me, it seems pretty obvious that there's something that driving this to a position of like complete collapse. I mean, go ahead.
What I think is driving this, and it's something that's accumulated over the years. It really is changing the vision of the United States as a unique country, because our leaders at the outset had been the victims of kingship. Right? They didn't want it. They had grown up. They were intellectual leaders who celebrated liberty, not the armored knight, as the greatness of the country, the right to march to your own rubber without fear of domestic or foreign predation, right? And so liberty is what was celebrated, not power. John Quincy Adams made this in 1821 address to Congress. Our march is the march of the mind, not the march of domination of the foot soldier. And we threw that out. We decided around the Spanish-American War, at least, let's be an empire. Let's replace the British. Let's go into the Philippines. Even though we're supposed to be fighting Cuba, let's go to Puerto Rico. Let's go to Guam. We can be we'll make the world safer democracy. If you told the American founders that we're here to make the world safer democracy, they would be appalled. They said, no, we're here to influence by example, but no, we got to keep with our rule of law here. We're not going to change the world and re-navigate, the DNA of the species. And so once we conceive of ourselves as a country, as being the empire, we got to control everything. We're super. We have all angelic DNA, as Madeleine Albright said. We see farther than everybody else. We're the chosen people. And then we're bringing all these great benefits to other people. You can't run an empire without an executive that's a Caesar. That's not secret. Every single empire has one person. You can't identify any empire in the history of the world that's operated with a legislative branch. So the Roman Senate ended as soon as it became an empire. And that's what we did. We decided, the hell with liberty. We want the power for its own sake. And we get the results that we see right now. And unless we change our culture to say, no, we don't care about ruling the world except by example. We care about liberty, the right to enable each person to develop their faculties and pursue their ambitions. That's good enough. We don't have to have flags everywhere and 800 foreign military bases. We don't care that. If that doesn't change, I can guarantee you we're going off a cliff like every prior 72 empires for the same reason. You can't extend, and escape bankruptcy and the hatred of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with Ryan. I agree with Bruce. You know, people sit back and say like APAC and whatever. The reality is, why do people lobby government? We lobby government because government creates winners and losers. Okay, the government didn't used to be in the business of picking winners and losers. The government decisions are consequential to many countries and to many businesses and to many individuals. And given the fact that government now makes decisions that are so consequential to so many people, obviously people want to influence that process. So that's natural. Hence this $400 million gift to Trump. So so everybody and influence peddling is a legal business in the U.S. Okay, when people talk about influence peddling, it's legal business, because politicians like that. If we go back, what were the preconditions? What did Madison say? And several of the other of our founding generation say. Ben Franklin, but one of several. I don't remember who said that. It might have been Franklin, but I could be wrong on that. Is that, and Madison, I think, also might have said this, is that once people could learn, they can start spending other people's money in the government. Okay, that's where tyranny, will begin. Yeah. Jefferson, and among others, said, once we have fiat money regimes, once we get away from gold, because they had a separation of money from the state. Okay, a separation from commerce and the state. Okay, Jefferson made a comment, said the federal government should only be about foreign policy. Okay, and that with respect to common and trade, leave that to merchants. Okay, and with respect to everything else, leave it to the states. Okay, that's what Jefferson said. So that was basically how we governed, until 1913. What happened in 1913? The government we created a Fed. We began implementing a fiat money regime, and we implemented the income tax, and we had the direct elections of senators, which further weakened state power relative to federal power. So, and then shortly after that, we went into World War I, and we decided that we wanted to really codify the U.S. as no longer a nation of sovereign individuals, but an empire where every individual had to subordinate themselves and their rights for the benefit of a growing empire. So I think the biggest problem is not the fact of Israel and these other countries. It's that Americans like the idea of an American empire. Americans like the idea of June 14th seeing nuclear weapons strolling down Pennsylvania Boulevard, and getting the most and hearing we got weapons that nobody else can ever think about. And this is what people think we should be proud about. We should be proud about that we have $1 trillion military budget, and we're going to put it on display, on Trump's birthday. So, we can remind the country, we can remind the world, that we're an empire, and that we can strike anyone, anywhere, anytime we want, and we're going to do it, and we don't care what anybody else has to say. It's the fact that Americans now like that, which is what creates all the incentives for people to corrupt the process in DC, because the decisions are so consequential. So obviously everyone wants to represent their interests and, repel. And there's competing interests. Israel has their lobby. Other groups have their lobbies, and we got to figure out how to make everyone happy. So as long as they help us get elected and keep giving us money. Now, if the U.S. was no longer an empire, didn't have fiat money, couldn't produce these deficits, if they can't produce these deficits, they can't spend this type of money. And when we have a very small government, and then if we want to go to war, the people would need the consent of the people, then nobody would pay attention to us. Okay, Israel would be knocking on our door because we're not involved with the world. We're involved in protecting our homeland and doing nothing other than protect our homeland. Like Smedley Butler.
I call it, Jeffrey, invincible self-defense, and pointing out, the parade that they anticipate down Pennsylvania Avenue. But where did it begin? Teddy Roosevelt in 1905, he sailed the Navy around the world. What was that for? Just to show, hey, we're an empire now. That's what it was about. Well, it wasn't that we weren't actually fighting any war at the time, but hey, we just had to flex our muscles, because we had to intimidate the Panama to give us the Panama Canal. And then soon we were going into Nicaragua and Dominican Republic and Mexico and all these other places. And it's not an accident that came right at the time of the Spanish-American War and suppressing self-determination in the Philippines. And because it came at the time then we did have at least the possibility, given our economic sinews, of becoming an empire. We had a choice. I say we made a Faustian bargain. Okay, even before we really didn't have the internal economic base to project empire globally, but then we said, we now have surpassed Britain with regard to tons of iron produced or whatever, and coal, and we have more railroads, and we have our ships are bigger. Here's our chance. The heck with Britain being the empire, we're going to replace it. And basically we did, starting with World War I. And that was something that we never got any pushback on that. No president has ever run on a campaign saying, the heck with the empire, we're going to retrieve the initial founding foreign policy of invincible self-defense.
One person ran a campaign and got booed during a debate. Ron Paul, remember?
Yeah, right. Well, I worked for Ron Paul's campaign. Yeah, I did.
But you remember when it was in the Reagan Library, that debate.
Yeah.
And he made a statement about our foreign policy, and he was booed for his statement.
But here's the big picture, though. Again, back to what I was saying, and I'm not disagreeing, because again, these are things that I find really hard to verify, but it could be like 49, 51%, right? That its majority could be a small difference, but I don't agree that I think Americans want empire. I do think there's a large growing number of people being convinced, like we were talking about, that now that's what we should want. But I guess the reason that I think that at least it's less defined, if, for example, like we were just talking about, that you take polls just about anywhere going over the last so many decades, Americans will by and large tell you they don't want more war, right? I mean, that's pretty consistent. Or the example of the elections we're talking about. I mean, in almost every single election now, we have the majority of, basically it ends up being what? It's like 40, like basically the majority of Americans pretty much don't participate pretty much every time. Then it's about 40%. Basically, I think it comes down to about 40-something% of the ones that do are independent. That fluctuates, right? It just continues to show you that what we're presented as the conversation is becoming less and less the actual majority. And lastly, that the government is always out there telling you, like, I guess the way to frame it is, why would they continue to profess to be altruistic, liberty, freedom, democracy, when we know that's not what they're pushing? I think it's that they know Americans, by and large, want the good picture, want the democracy republic idea, and are, need to convince us that what they're doing is that. Now, I could be wrong, right? Trust me, I see a growing number and it worries me where this goes, but I just have to hold on to that idea that I think that as long as they're pretending to be that good thing, I think at least they think the most of us still want that. That's the way I would look at it. Hopeful note, anyway.
Well, I just don't think that listen, there's small dissent. Very seldom you have unanimity, but the political leadership structure and the military industrial, what I call security complex, is so overwhelming that people don't really have it. They can't vote for anti-empire candidates. Point one, running for Ron Paul, they wouldn't let him speak at the Republican National Convention in 2012. And so he did get some supports, but it didn't have an impact, not enough to actually have an impact on our foreign policy. We continue to do all the dumb things. We continue to expand our military profile, 800 military bases, $1 trillion spending here and there without any restraints whatsoever, no congressional oversight of any of this stuff. I remember Ron and some others brought a suit against Obama for the war in Libya, thrown out because there was an absence of standing, but there wasn't that real the public support was, I guess I would say that irresolute. And they say, well, I don't want to put enough, effort into it. If we want to fight the war, go ahead. I agree that I don't think the ordinary American citizen gets enough out of war to be enthusiastic behind it. But right now, because we're able to pass on the real cost, the soldiers over there who die, and the financial pinch is so muted because we borrow all the money to fight the war. We don't raise taxes. I mean, that goes back to World War I, when McAdoo, the Secretary of Treasury, tells Woodrow Wilson, "There's no way we can fight this war if we got to raise taxes. So we got to borrow money." That's why our debt went from 1 to 29 billion over the period of World War I. But there isn't, and the only way you're going to get, I think, a concerted pushback is you got to inculcate these values at the school level. It's got to be part of the civic culture. No, invincible self-defense is what we have. We care more about liberty than being an empire. And if we got to choose between the two, we choose liberty and the heck with empire. Get off of these 800 military bases. We don't want to be there. It's just open season for somebody who doesn't like us, whether they're in Thailand or in Saudi Arabia or some other place. And that's where I go back. And ultimately, if I wanted to change the country's foreign policy and attitude to government, I want to get in the textbooks. I want to tell the teachers, not this other drivel that they debate about. We got to raise a whole new culture that understands why that our glory at the outset was liberty. It wasn't domination. It was the march of the mind, not the march of the foot soldier. That's what we got to get back with, and should start at age 5.
Well, I think we've had a great conversation where we're approaching almost 2 hours now. So why don't I let Ryan and then Bruce make, for any points that you would have liked to have discussed today or any final words you have. Ryan, why don't you go ahead, and things that are important to you that, that you haven't had time to speak up, why don't you use this time to do so without any pressure of a clock? Whatever, however much time you want to take to talk about whatever you want to talk about, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I'll just wrap and just, say again, I appreciate this conversation, and thank you, Jeffrey, for putting this on in general, and Bruce for taking the time to continue to have this conversation. I mean, we've clearly been focusing consistently on, at least the few times we've connected, on constitutional issues and different things. And I think that I'm sure we can get into plenty of the topics, but I when I first talked about this, I mean, I guess really the kind of the beginning of the immigration conversation in Trump's recent administration and the floating ideas of, the deporting people, like I immediately said, okay, this is the most important thing happening to Americans in this country right now. And I still stand by that. I mean, and it's not just the one focal point of the topic. It's all the different pieces it connects to. It's just the degradation of the Constitution, and rather the honoring of it from our government. And so I really appreciate the time to talk about this in an objective way. And I just want to stress people out there that, you got to, in my opinion, it behooves you to stop falling into the political partisan pressure. Stop, engage with every conversation with what you believe in, what your principles are, and engage with it in alignment with that. And if it goes against what the party's saying, then maybe you should reflect on whether aligning with the party all the time is in your best interest, whether that's left or right. Align with what you believe in and your principles and your values. There's never been a more important time for that. And I think right now, every day people are making these choices about whether they really do want the things that they thought they voted for, or they're willing to accept the picture that's being presented, even though they feel that that's not exactly what they want. It's like, lean into what you truly believe in. And so again, thank you guys for having this conversation, because I do think this is paramount. And every moment we let this continue in the wrong direction is a one step closer to like we talked about, Congress and impeachment. And, we may get to a point to where this is the point of no return. Not to be hyperbolic or alarmist, but I think we're seeing pretty rapid decisions. So let's have these conversations. So thank you guys.
Bruce?
I can't improve on James Madison. How knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. That's the message of the day. It's the message for any people who want to be self-governing.
I think one of the things, contrary to what Madison had to say, I think didn't Einstein say something like, well, one of the things that is infinite is people's stupidity?
Yeah. Man's intelligence is sharply rationed, but stupidity is infinite. Yeah.
I'll add one more quote to that, actually. And I think it's Russell Bertrand, if I remember correctly, but it's the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser men so full of doubts. And it's like, the idea is just there's so many people out there, or even better, Mark Twain, right? It's not what you know for sure that gets you in trouble, or not what you know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Damn it, if that's not everything in the world today.
Well, on that note, I think those are great final words. And again, Ryan and Bruce, I want to thank you so much. This is a really fun way for me to spend my time. And I hope people who watch this find this a very valuable conversation. I think they should find it a valuable conversation. So I think they're more on if they don't find it a valuable. So thank you both very much.
Okay, sign off.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
See you
you.
next time.